Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. One of the major themes in Romeo and Juliet is fate. Fate is the idea that the events in our lives are predetermined and set, that there is nothing we can do to escape them. Now, in Romeo and Juliet, we can pick out examples of this from the plot, like when Romeo predicts his own death before going to the Capulet ball, or when Friar John fails to deliver the important letter to Romeo. But we can also look at some of the more sophisticated ways Shakespeare presents this key theme. In a 2010 Oxford University lecture, Dr. Emma Smith explored how Shakespeare's use of a prologue at the start of the play fits into the theme of fate. Dr. Smith points out that there are a handful of Shakespeare plays that contain a prologue, but those prologues usually establish the scene. So, for example, the prologue in Troilus and Cressida tells us about the Trojan Wars, and that's an important backdrop to the play. What's unique to Romeo and Juliet is that it contains a prologue which summarises the entire plot in the biggest spoiler ever. Smith asks, what does it do to our experience of the play to have this clear statement of what will happen before it begins? Well, for one, it reminds us of the theme of fate, that no matter what the characters do to try and avoid it, Romeo and Juliet, our star-crossed lovers, are fated to die. So, for example, we can watch Friar Lawrence come up with his bizarre plans to try and make it all turn out okay, but we know, because the prologue told us, that they will not work. Romeo and Juliet's fate has already been decided. So by telling us right away what will happen in the play, it's reinforcing the idea that these things are inevitable, and that inevitability is a key element of fate. Even the use of the sonnet form for the prologue reinforces the idea of fate. The sonnet form has a sense of what Smith calls syntactical inevitability. We know the rules of a sonnet: 14 lines, iambic pentameter, ABA, BC, DC, DE, FE, FGG, rhyme scheme. So again, there is a sense that we know structurally what is coming next in a sonnet before it even happens, when we read the prologue with an understanding of the sonnet form. Again, this reinforces the idea of inevitability, and with it, fate. Finally, Smith points out how inevitability is also presented in Shakespeare's use of genre. Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. We know the generic conventions of a tragedy, which include the death of the tragic hero, so again there is a sense of inescapability to the whole thing, just by the fact the play is a tragedy. Benvolio can tell Romeo to flee after the killing of Tybalt to escape the punishment of death threatened by the prince, but the audience knows that it's fated to happen. Romeo might escape for a moment here, but it will catch up with him another way. And so Smith points out how the prologue, its sonnet form, and the genre of the play itself all highlight the theme of fate, and there are other things we can add to that analysis too. In his 1975 essay The Visual Artistry of Romeo and Juliet, James Black points out how the entire play is filled with parallel scenes that mirror each other. Black refers to what he labels stage pictures, which are shown twice or more than twice in the play. Let's look at some examples. In Act 2, Scene 2, Romeo is in the orchard talking to Juliet, who appears aloft at the window. In Act 3, Scene 5, the scene starts with Romeo in Juliet's room, but he soon descends and is once again in the orchard, talking to Juliet above at the window. The two scenes, then, are mirror images of each other. As I've explored in my character analysis video, Paris and Romeo are often seen in parallel moments. At the end of Act 1, Scene 1, Benvolio tells Romeo to take his mind off Rosaline by looking at other beautiful women. In the very next scene, Capulet gives Paris similar advice. Shakespeare employs the same metaphors for the two characters. Nurse calls Paris a man of wax in Act 1, Scene 3, whilst Friar Lawrence tells Romeo, thy noble shape is but a form of wax in Act 3, Scene 3. In Act 2, Scene 3, Romeo tells Friar Lawrence how he has fallen in love with Juliet, and Friar Lawrence advises Romeo to slow down, telling him wisely and slow, they stumble that run fast. In Act 3, Scene 6, Paris tells Friar Lawrence how the marriage with Juliet is to take place on Thursday, and the friar replies, on Thursday, sir, the time is very short. So Friar Lawrence cautions both Romeo and Paris against their hasty pursuit of Juliet. In Act 2, Scene 6, Friar Lawrence waits in his cell with Romeo, and as Juliet approaches, Friar Lawrence says, here comes the lady. Similarly, in Act 4, Scene 1, Friar Lawrence waits in his cell with Paris, and when Juliet enters, Friar Lawrence says, here comes the lady. And in Act 5, Scene 3, Paris attends with his page, telling him, give me those flowers, whilst Romeo attends with his servant, telling him, give me that mattock and the wrenching iron. Why might Shakespeare want the audience to see Paris and Romeo as similar? Well, we're once again reminded of the key theme of fate in the play. If it were not for the fact that Romeo was from the enemy Montague family, the audience realises that Romeo could and almost certainly would be the one seeking out Capulet's blessing for the marriage. He would be pursuing Juliet in the socially accepted mode of the day. Seeing Paris pursue Juliet this way heightens the sense of tragedy that the star-crossed lovers cannot do the same. But in a more complex reading, the parallels between Paris and Romeo are just part of this bigger picture of parallels in the entire play, and there are many more. Black points out how the prince's 3 appearances are all mirror images of each other. In Act 1, Scene 1, Act 3, Scene 1, and Act 5, Scene 3, we see the Prince, Lord Montague and Lord Capulet on stage together, and on all 3 occasions Prince stands to arbitrate between the families. Another obvious example of mirroring is seen when Juliet is found having faked her death in Act 4, Scene 5, and then Juliet is found to actually be dead in Act 5, Scene 3. And finally, as I've already explored in the Benvolio character analysis video, there are a number of occasions where a character on stage retells events that the audience has already just witnessed. In Act 1, Scene 1, after the brawl, Benvolio tells Montague what has happened. Then in Act 3, Scene 1, after the deaths of Mercutio and Tybalt, Benvolio tells the prince what has happened. In Act 5, Scene 3, the friar does the same, retelling pretty much the whole plot. In these examples, the audience sees something happen, and then immediately after, hears a retelling of the same events. So why does the audience see or hear similar things time and time again? In terms of our key theme of fate, we can say that the continual repetition of events reflects how they are inescapable. Everything seems to be cyclical, going round and round in circles. It's happened before, it'll happen again. Romeo and Juliet's fate is sealed, it's inescapable. Black makes a different point though. To him, things are always more intense when they are repeated. So in the first balcony scene, Juliet warns Romeo that it's dangerous for him to be found in the orchard, and that's a warning Romeo dismisses, but by the second balcony scene, all Verona is mortal to him, as Romeo has been banished following the murder of Tybalt. Black explains the parallels emphasise the differences. Things look the same, but are painfully altered. And Black calls this the process of intensification through parallel. Think again about the parallels of the meetings at Friar Lawrence's cell. Yes, there are lots of similarities, but Juliet and Romeo met rapturously at Lawrence's cell, whilst the meeting with Paris is at a time when things have become much more terrible. The friar and audience know that Juliet has secretly married Romeo, that's the Romeo who's just killed Tybalt and been banished, and that she now has been ordered by her father to marry Paris. And how about the 3 appearances of the prince? In Act 1, Scene 1, he arrives after a fight, but everyone's still alive. In Act 3, Scene 1, things have intensified, and he arrives shortly after the deaths of Tybalt and Mercutio. In Act 5, Scene 3, things have intensified even further, and he arrives after the deaths of Romeo, Juliet, and Paris. So here is the key. Yes, we see the same kind of things happening time and time again, but each time things are more intense, the tension is greater, and of course the conflict is building up and up to the final tragic ending that we all know is coming. Now, in Romeo and Juliet, it's often revealing to explore the first time an audience meets a character. Also, sometimes something happens in the play that doesn't seem to make sense in terms of what we've come to expect. Let's look at some examples. Firstly, why does the nurse speak in blank verse when the audience first meets her in Act 1, Scene 3? Shakespeare essentially uses 3 different types of speech for characters: blank verse, prose, and rhymed verse. Blank verse is iambic pentameter that does not rhyme. It has lines of 10 syllables with alternating unstressed and stressed syllables. In your copy of the play, blank verse looks like poetry written out on the page, and blank verse is typically used by upper-class characters and the nobility. Prose is ordinary written language. There's no rhyme scheme or specific metrical structure. In your copy of the play, prose looks like ordinary written sentences and paragraphs. Usually, prose is given to characters of low social status or those engaged in comic scenes. Rhymed verse is, unsurprisingly, lines of verse which rhyme. Shakespeare also uses rhyming couplets, 2 lines that rhyme, often in iambic pentameter, to signal the end of a scene. Again, it looks like poetry on the page. So in what is a definite break from the norm, Shakespeare uses blank verse for the nurse's dialogue in Act 1, Scene 3. There are times later in the play when she drops into prose, like when she jokes with Juliet, but it's significant that the first time we meet her, she's speaking in blank verse. And of course the question is why? Why would Shakespeare use blank verse for a lower class character? Well, for one, Shakespeare's highlighting how the nurse's character is significant, not to be written off as simply a source of comic relief. The nurse, or more specifically what she symbolises in the play, is important. Secondly, perhaps Shakespeare is showing us how Nurse transcends her status as a lower-class character due to the closeness of her relationship with Juliet. Nurse is essentially a surrogate parent to Juliet, just like Friar Lawrence is to Romeo, and the blank verse symbolises this. So what does the nurse symbolise? Crystal Bartolowicz, in her piece, first as tragedy, then as gender, genre, history and Romeo and Juliet, explores how the nurse represents nurturing and comedy. Bartolowicz points out how Nurse not only nurtures Juliet, but also nurtures the relationship between Romeo and Juliet. After meeting Romeo in Act 1, Scene 5, Juliet asks Nurse to identify him. Then in Act 2, Scene 4, Juliet confides in her nurse and sends her to meet Romeo. It is the nurse who takes the rope ladder needed for Romeo to ascend into Juliet's chamber, and the nurse who sets it up in Act 3, Scene 2. It's the nurse who's sent to deliver a message and a ring to Romeo at Friar Lawrence's cell in Act 3, Scene 3, snatching away a dagger from Romeo, who offers to stab himself in the same scene. It's the nurse who warns Juliet in Act 3, Scene 5 that her mother's about to walk into the room and find Romeo with her. And it's the nurse who stands up to Capulet in the same scene, telling him you are to blame to rate her so. We therefore see very clearly that the nurse has a nurturing role, both nurturing Juliet but also the relationship between the two lovers. In terms of comedy, Nurse is arguably the funniest character in the entire play, and I don't think I need to go into examples here, but you can see my character analysis video for a number of examples. Now, if Nurse represents nurturing and comedy, and Shakespeare's use of blank verse presents these as significant, the next question is, why doesn't she appear on stage at the end of the play? This is one of those things that we would say doesn't quite make sense. The prologue tells us that Romeo and Juliet's death will bury their parents' strife, and at first glance it does seem that the play ends on a positive note, with Montague pledging to create Juliet's statue in pure gold. But is it really a case of and they all lived happily ever after? Crystal Bartolowicz explores the staging at the end of the play. In the final scene, who does the audience see on stage? The Act 5, Scene 3 stage directions tell us that there are over a dozen characters there. Paris, Page, Romeo, Balthazar, Friar Lawrence, Juliet, First Watchman, Second Watchman, Third Watchman, Prince Escalus, attendants, Montague, Capulet, Lady Capulet, and unnamed others. So basically we see almost everyone except the nurse. In Shakespeare's play, Friar Lawrence explains, "To the marriage her nurse is privy." But why isn't Nurse there to explain her side of the story? Her absence at the end of the play is all the more notable, Bartolowicz points out, because the Arthur Brooke poem Romeo and Juliet from 1562, and a text known as the principal source for Shakespeare's play, does mention the nurse at the end, telling us the nurse of Juliet is banished in her age. So why does Shakespeare leave the nurse out? Well, I asked Crystal Bartolowicz about this, and I'm going to use her reply with permission, as it's so helpful to those of us studying the play. What I was trying to suggest is that the ending of the play presents us with tragic social order, from which the nurse is specifically excluded because she represents attributes that are also absent from the unredeemed social order we have at the end of the play: nurturing and comedy. So the ending of the play does contain some positive resolution, as the prologue told us. It does bury their parents' strife. However, the absence of Nurse on stage reminds us that this is not the case for everyone. The nurse, and the nurturing and comedy she represents, has disappeared forever. Another interesting first character appearance is that of Friar Lawrence. Shakespeare introduces Friar Lawrence in Act 2, Scene 3, with the character giving a very long speech about the power of plants when Romeo arrives. His speech is 30 lines long, about a topic which seems inconsequential. Why does Shakespeare do this? The friar explains how within the infant rind of this small flower, poison hath residence and medicine power. In other words, some plants have the capacity for both good and evil, depending on how they are used. This speech foreshadows the apothecary's use of poison later in the play, but it can also be seen as a significant part of the friar's character. Jonathan Marks writes, Friar Lawrence reads vice and virtue, grace and rebellion into nature, but he thinks that the virtue or vice of things depends on their right or wrong use, and that he is capable of distinguishing between right and wrong use, and even of transforming vice into virtue through his knowledge. Virtue and vice, grace and rebellion are objects to be manipulated by the knower of nature. The friar's activities suggest that he thinks he can use human beings just as he uses herbs. He attempts to use Romeo and Juliet to make peace between the Montagues and Capulets, concerning himself more with this objective than the souls of the young lovers. We therefore see a friar who mistakenly thinks his skill with plants can be applied to the world of humans, and the results of his thinking are of course tragic. It's also interesting to think about the first time we meet Benvolio. Let's look at Benvolio's first lines: "Part fools, put up your swords, you know not what you do." The phrase "you know not what you do" would remind the contemporary audience of the words of Jesus in the Bible, in which he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This biblical echo is all the more impactful when we consider Shakespeare's use of structure. Samson and Gregory's sexual innuendo and puns from just moments before contrast greatly with Benvolio's religious language. When we add the fact that the name Benvolio translates roughly to peacekeeper, the audience might assume that he will fulfill a Christ-like religious role in the play, and there is some truth to this, although it's not clear-cut, and I explore that in my Benvolio character analysis video. But even if we take Benvolio at his best and see him as a peacekeeper and semi-religious figure, he's still unable to stop things that are fated to happen. If Romeo and Juliet are star-crossed as the prologue suggests, then nothing is able to prevent their deaths. Even the Christ-like Benvolio fits into this. Despite his best efforts, he cannot prevent the tragedy from unfolding. Despite trying to stop the fight in Act 1 Scene 1, the fighting continues. Despite trying to prevent a fight in Act 1 Scene 3, there is a fight. Despite bending the truth in his report to the prince in Act 3 Scene 1 in order to prevent Romeo's death, Romeo dies anyway. We therefore see that despite his best efforts and semi-religious status, Benvolio is unable to prevent things from happening, and his character reminds the audience that fate determines what takes place in life. Something else that doesn't make a whole lot of sense is the sudden change in Paris's characterization. Up until Act 5, Shakespeare presents Paris in an overly negative manner. Interestingly, in Act 5, Paris suddenly comes to life as a character in his own right. For a start, we get the sense that Paris truly cares about Juliet as he goes to cover her tomb with flowers. Thinking Romeo has come to the tomb to do some villainous shame to the dead bodies, he ends up fighting him, and Romeo kills Paris. As he dies, Paris asks Romeo to lay me with Juliet, to which Romeo agrees. Paris's actions here are not those of a villain or a bumbling idiot as we've seen in the first 4 acts. They are heroic and more in line with what we've come to know of Romeo. Even Romeo sees how similar he is to Paris, saying, "Oh, give me thy hand, one writ with me in sour misfortune's book." So why does Shakespeare present Paris so valiantly in this final act? Well, in Shakespearean tragedy and its double, Kent Cartwright states, Paris's very position as Romeo's antagonist makes him, of course, the reprise of Tybalt. An antagonist is a character, or sometimes a group of characters, who acts in opposition to the protagonist, the main character. The protagonist, Romeo, wants to be with Juliet, but the antagonist, Paris, gets in his way, resulting in a fight to the death. What's so clever is that now the previous antagonist, Tybalt, is dead, Shakespeare needed someone else to take on the role to keep the dramatic tension high, and for this reason the previously one-dimensional, idiotic Paris now transforms into a brave and heroic character willing to fight to the death to defend the honour of Juliet. And so, whilst at first glance Paris seems little more than a one-dimensional villain, Shakespeare draws parallels between him and Romeo, transforming his character into something much more significant as the play comes to a close. Another interesting point is how it doesn't make sense how quickly Lord Capulet changes his mind about Paris marrying Juliet. In Act 1 Scene 2, Capulet told Paris to woo Juliet for himself. But in Act 3 Scene 4, the very next day, Capulet suddenly decides the marriage will go ahead in a couple of days' time. I think she will be ruled in all respects by me, nay more, I doubt it not. So what has changed? We know for certain that Paris has not had a chance to woo Juliet. She gave her attention to Romeo at the ball. Why has Capulet changed his mind? Today, we instinctively know that Capulet's actions are wrong. We know that Juliet should be making her own choices about whom she marries. But in Elizabethan England, an audience would not necessarily feel the same way. Arranged marriages were common for upper-class families. So what does Shakespeare want his audience to think about Capulet and his patriarchal control? Whilst an Elizabethan audience would have been familiar with Capulet's position to choose his daughter's husband, what no audience would be able to understand is his sudden change of mind. Shakespeare is implying very clearly that Capulet and what he symbolises is wrong. It's similar to Mr. Burling in An Inspector Calls. The dramatic irony of him saying the Germans don't want war and the Titanic is unsinkable is used to ridicule the character and by extension what he stands for. And it's the same with Capulet. His complete change of mind ridicules him as a character and therefore ridicules what he stands for, which is the Patriarchy. Patriarchy is a system in which men possess power and women are excluded from it. Patriarchy also refers specifically to a family where the father is in control, and we see both in Romeo and Juliet. Juliet's father decides whom she marries and when. Paris discusses his marriage proposal with Lord Capulet, not with Juliet. So is Shakespeare endorsing patriarchy or criticising it? In one way, we can see the play as an endorsement of patriarchal control. The two lovers who break the rules end up dead after all. But Capulet's sudden change of mind undermines his character. By extension, this undermines what he represents about patriarchal control. Let's finish with an idea about the parallels between Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet are both young. Juliet is 13, we know this from Act 1, Scene 2, where Capulet explains she hath not seen the change of 14 years, in other words, she hasn't yet had her 14th birthday. Now, we don't have a clear indication of Romeo's age, but we can be certain he is still an adolescent like Juliet. One piece of evidence for this is that he still lives with his parents, seen when they tell Benvolio in Act 1, Scene 1 how Romeo, private in his chamber, pens himself, meaning he locks himself in his bedroom. Secondly, as Susan Snyder points out in Shakespeare, A Wayward Journey, in the same scene Montague says that Romeo is like the bud bit with an envious worm, ere he can spread his sweet leaves to the air. This imagery suggests Romeo has not yet arrived at maturity. He's still a bud. A bud is a part of a plant which has not yet developed into a leaf or flower. Shakespeare also uses structure to draw parallels between the youth of Romeo and Juliet. Before we meet Romeo himself, his parents talk about him with concern, and the same can be said with Juliet. Snyder notes how each of the two protagonists is introduced to us first as the object of parental concern. Before we meet Romeo, we learn that his parents are worried about his sadness in Act 1, Scene 1, and in the very next scene, Capulet is working on his daughter's future through negotiating her marriage to Paris. Shakespeare's use of structure is key here. Not only are these two scenes consecutive to highlight the similarities between the two, but the way in which both are spoken about by their parents before we as an audience meet them highlights how they are both adolescents. Now, just like with James Black's work, when we consider the similarities between the two characters, it makes the differences all the more noticeable. Let's look at one of those differences in terms of setting. Here is a list of every setting in the play. Let's look at where we see Romeo and where we see Juliet in the play. There are two things to note here. Firstly, Juliet rarely leaves her parents' property. In fact, she only does so when she heads to Friar Lawrence's cell. Shakespeare's use of setting reminds us of the patriarchal society in which Juliet lives. The use of setting for Juliet reinforces this. Apart from a brief visit to the friar in Act 4, Scene 1, Juliet is always seen in her father's property. In stark contrast to this, not only is Romeo never seen at home, the Montague household doesn't even feature as a setting in the play, but, as Arati Kanikia points out in Architecture's Pretext Spaces of Translation, Romeo's presence can be traced at every location that is mentioned in the play. So, Romeo essentially appears everywhere at some point or another. Whilst Juliet remains at home, Romeo is free to roam the streets, is bold enough to enter the property of his sworn enemy. Juliet is in bondage whilst Romeo is not. The differing expectations of a young man and a young woman in Elizabethan England are evident through the locations in which the characters appear. Juliet is cautious because she has to be. She doesn't have the same freedom as Romeo, not because of any age difference, but because of patriarchal society and its treatment of women. If you found this video useful, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel.